I'll start this video discussing the rise and fall of photojournalism and then take you through a recent week-long assignment that I undertook for the UK Sunday Times in Zimbabwe. During the past 2 decades, this type of work has declined sharply, and it's now only on really rare occasions that I get asked to do this kind of job. The invention of the Leica 35mm camera in 1925 opened the way for modern photojournalism. Before this, a professional quality photograph required bulky equipment. So this invention meant that photographers could go just about anywhere and take photos unobtrusively without dragging big view cameras, lights and tripods around. It was a revolution in a time before television took center stage. Newspapers and magazines began publishing more and more photographs, but it was Henry Luce, who made his name working with Time magazine and Fortune magazine, that conceived of a new general interest publication that would be picture-driven. Life magazine was launched on the 23rd of November 1936. The picture story became the ultimate in photojournalism, and the medium produced its own superstars like Margaret Bourke-White, Eugene Smith, and Alfred Eisenstadt. In the late 40s, another group of high-profile photographers that included Robert Capa and Henri Cartier-Bresson started the collective Magnum. In the 80s and 90s, when I was working in this field, picture magazines like Life were already on the decline, but newspapers and magazines were still running a lot of reportage, so there was plenty of work about for photographers. There were loads of picture agencies that would syndicate the work of freelancers, and the big newspapers hired staffers or freelancers to cover all the big stories of the time. By the late 90s, the signs were beginning to show that photojournalism's glory days were over. The fall of this field of photography can be perfectly tracked against the rise of the internet. Readers no longer had to wait for a newspaper to arrive to see what's going on in the world. Photojournalism is one of those professions that is burnt brightly for a short time and then fades away. It's possible that in 50 years people might look back on the profession in a similar manner to how we feel about town criers in medieval England, who would stand in the town square and shout out the latest news. I do think that the need for strong reportage photography will remain in some limited form, but photographers will have to learn their craft without the media publishing structures that they had in the past. I'll now take you through an actual photojournalistic assignment that I did a few weeks ago, covering the challenges that the people of Zimbabwe are facing. By the early 2000s, photojournalistic assignments were starting to fade away. And even though in general it wasn't a good sign for photography, personally I felt some relief that I could actually take a breath. For over 10 years I'd spent more time away than I had at home. The novelty of wondering where I would find myself each week had begun to wear thin. It was always exciting to have the adventure of being transported from a very predictable home life into a foreign environment. But the relentless adrenaline fluctuations definitely took their toll. Over the past few decades, I've covered the Zimbabwe situation for various publications, so at the beginning of this year I was happy to receive the call saying, will I accompany the Sunday Times journalist to Zimbabwe? I'll include images in this video that I took during this trip and in previous trips, as well as excerpts from an interview from visual scholar Carl Schonland. He asked me general questions about working as a photojournalist, about this particular assignment, as well as the situation on the ground in the country. Picture editors will only assign this kind of work to photographers who have had a decent amount of exposure and have built a reputation. So it's a real catch-22 situation. You need to get the experience, but you're not going to get the work until you get the experience. In my case, I was lucky enough to have done 5 years working with an international agency, Reuters. So by the time I'd shifted to working for foreign newspapers and magazines, I'd already had a lot of experience and built a bit of a reputation for delivering on assignments. For this story, we received a fairly wide brief, a sort of state-of-the-nation type story, providing an overview of the country and its people 4 years after the previous president, Robert Mugabe, had been removed. Briefs and the approach one takes can vary from one job to another. It depends on the type of publication that you're working for, the particular story, as well as the journalist that you've been assigned with. Sometimes it's a joint process between the journalist and yourself, thrashing out the story as a team on the ground. Sometimes the photographer is required to illustrate the writer's story, and at other times the journalist and the photographer can work in parallel, creating two compatible pieces. Sometimes the story moves towards the pictures, and at other times it moves towards the text. The ruling party in Zim is very wary of foreign media, so we decided to go in as tourists. There's been a lot of violence recently directed at anyone opposing the government, so we had to keep a really low profile. We used safe houses for interviews, and we didn't expose ourselves as journalists in public. This obviously had an impact in the manner in which we worked. I always had to weigh up the importance of taking any shot. If I decided to go ahead, I had to work out how I was going to do it, and then I'd quickly take my camera out the bag and shoot off a few frames. You definitely don't have time to think through details like composition. You just have to trust that those things will kick in when you start photographing. One often sets up a few interviews before arriving in the country. These interactions give one broad brushstroke ideas of what's going on, as well as opening up ideas for what one can focus on. Our first interview was with a member of parliament for the opposition party called Jasmine Tofa. Late last year, a mob of supporters for the ruling party beat her up and severely fractured both her hands. She had to have metal plates inserted in both of them. While she was being interviewed, I was capturing some portraits, and she was describing how at one point during the beating she had cried out for her dead mother. A tear or two rolled down her cheek, and for me the combination of sorrow and horror in her expression sums up the present situation in this country. She also gave us a lot more information about the situation in the country in general. It's usually a stepping stone type process of following one lead and then looking around to see where one should head off next. We heard that the commuter train system had collapsed, so we headed out to the Bulawayo station. There we found abandoned carriages just left rusting. It felt so poignant because the Rhodesian railway system, now Zimbabwe, was built during the colonial times by Cecil John Rhodes, and this section of his railway track was fundamental to his Cape to Cairo dream. This thread of decay then led us to visit the remains of the Bulawayo racecourse, which during its heyday was called the Ascot of Africa. Old rusting grandstands remain in an overgrown field, and there are a few bits of racecourse paraphernalia scattered about. By the time we arrived in the capital Harare, we had a clear idea that the main issues that we wanted to highlight were firstly the political violence and intimidation by the ruling party. The second was decay. the falling apart of infrastructure, and general system failures. The third was the blatant and widening gap between the ruling elite and their cronies, and the ever-increasing number of people living in conditions of dire poverty. We visited a gated community in which the rich and powerful live. The staff are barred from living anywhere near this compound. It's real economic apartheid. One Zimbabwe oligarch in the Borrowdale Brook community had 9 of his luxury cars parked outside, one of them a Rolls-Royce. Just 15 minutes drive from this elite community are huge groups of people living in open fields. They've built shacks from bits of metal, wood and plastic that they've found. There are no services provided and the children don't attend school. The real disaster of Zimbabwe is that it's not just a short-term problem. The people have been worn down over decades by despotic rulers and have pretty much given up the hope of change. It's such a different process for a photographer when you work in conditions that demand that you have to watch your back. You often don't have the luxury of space to see the big picture, so one's focus can become limited. It takes effort and energy to work in this manner because you are having to split your awareness. One part is tracking the danger level, while another part is thinking, okay, let's get a good picture. This process of decompartmentalizing your attention is standard operating procedure for any photographer working in environments involving risk. This way of working is very different from when you're in a situation where you can be free to operate. Also, photojournalism in general involves a very different process of seeing and photographing to that which I employ when doing my personal work. It's so far apart that it's a bit like choosing when you go out whether you want Mexican or Italian. They really are completely different things. The two considerations that I had to keep in mind on this job was that we could be stopped and searched at any time, and also the story was for a Sunday newspaper, and that meant the deadline was really Friday afternoon. So I edited and captioned the images as I went along and uploaded them via WeTransfer. And then we wrapped it up and flew back home, the journalist to London and me to Cape Town. And then I carried on making YouTube videos like this one. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you next time, and thanks very much for watching.
Is it over yet?
Yes, it is good. It really is.
What are they?
Well,
and find out what the future holds in store.
Is it over yet?